The Grand View Hotel, an architectural jewel of Asheville, stood out as the most luxurious place in the region. Its polished stone exterior walls reflected the glow of the setting sun, while the interior boasted impeccable design. White marble on the floor, crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, and carefully aligned leather furniture. It was a place where the elite met, where wealth was not just a privilege, but an identity. And that late afternoon, the perfect world of the Grand View suffered an unexpected interruption. Evelyn Craig entered with cautious but determined steps. Her old coat was patched in several places, and her left shoe had a sole so worn that it made a peculiar sound with every step. The lobby seemed to freeze as she walked through the revolving doors. Conversations were interrupted, glances thrown. A woman in an expensive dress discreetly tugged at her fur coat, as if Evelyn's mere presence would contaminate it. A man in a suit whispered something to his friend, who smiled and nodded, both sharing muffled laughter. Evelyn didn't look at anyone. Her focus was on the reception desk. She held tightly to the strap of her faded fabric bag, where she kept a small object that was her only connection to the man she was about to face. She knew it would be difficult, but she was ready. Decades of suffering had given her something that no amount of money could buy: resilience. Before she could reach the counter, a burly-looking security guard quickly approached. He was wearing a fitted black suit, and his gaze was cold and impenetrable. "Ma'am, can I help you?" he asked, but his tone was not one of hospitality. It was a warning. Evelyn raised her eyes to meet his. Despite her wrinkled face and the deep circles under her eyes that showed she'd had a bad night's sleep, her eyes still shone with determination. "I need to speak to Logan Stewart," she said, her voice hoarse but firm. The security guard raised an eyebrow, as if she had said something absurd. "Mr. Stewart is not available. He doesn't see visitors without an appointment," he replied, measuring her from head to toe. "And frankly, this place isn't right for you." "He'll want to see me," Evelyn insisted without backing down. "Please, just tell him it's very important." The security guard let out a low, ironic laugh, attracting the attention of other guests. A small group began to form, people trying to disguise their curiosity but clearly fascinated by the scene. "Look, it doesn't work like that. I suggest you leave the way you came in," he said, now with a harsher tone. "This is a luxury hotel, and people like you—" He stopped, perhaps realizing that he had gone too far. But Evelyn didn't need him to complete the sentence. She knew what "people like you" meant. It was a sentence she had heard countless times since losing everything. Before he could make any move to throw her out, Evelyn pulled something out of her bag, a small reliquary necklace worn and darkened by time. She carefully opened the necklace, revealing a tiny old photo of a family. A man with a broad smile and protective arms wrapped around a young woman, and between them a bright-eyed baby. She lifted the reliquary towards the security guard, her hand trembling. "Show him this. He'll understand." The security guard hesitated, looking at the necklace. He seemed about to ignore her completely, but something in her voice, or perhaps in the image on the reliquary, made him take the object. He examined it briefly before sighing and walking over to the reception desk. As he waited, Evelyn felt the weight of the stairs around him. She could hear the whispers growing. Who let this woman in? She must be crazy. Maybe she's here to beg. A woman with perfect hair and a designer dress approached, as if to examine Evelyn closely, before laughing discreetly and commenting to the man next to her. It seems that even the indigent have the audacity to dream. Evelyn remained motionless, although inside she felt her heart racing. Her cheeks burned with shame, but she refused to show weakness. For years she had endured much worse humiliations than this. Another employee approached her and said, "Madam, you can't stay here. This place is not for—" He hesitated, looking her over from head to toe, choosing his words carefully. "Beggars. Maybe you should try a shelter. I'm waiting to speak to Logan." Evelyn replied. Mr. Stewart? She looked at her as if she was in on a joke. Good luck with the wait. After a few minutes that seemed like hours, the security guard returned, now accompanied by a tall, imposing man. Logan Stewart. He wore a tailored grey suit, and his posture exuded authority. His gaze travelled quickly over Evelyn, and the discomfort that formed on his face was unmistakable. He held the reliquary in his hand, examining it as he walked. He stopped a few steps away from her and lifted the object. "Madam, what is this? Who gave you this necklace?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Evelyn looked up at him, feeling a wave of emotion run through her body. For a moment, everything she had been rehearsing to say disappeared. There he was, her son, now a man she barely recognized. "Well, that's my necklace. I'm your mother, Logan," she said, her voice shaking. The reaction was immediate. Logan gave a short, cold laugh, shaking his head as he looked around, clearly uncomfortable with the curious stares that were now fixed on them. "My mother," he repeated, as if the idea was absurd. He raised the reliquary again. "Is this some kind of trick? Because if it is, I have to warn you that it won't work. I've dealt with several con artists pretending to be my mother before, and they were only after money. I'm not falling for that anymore." Evelyn tried to get closer, but Logan held up his hand to stop her. "My mother died a long time ago. I don't know who you are, but I don't have time for this kind of thing." "Please, Logan," Evelyn begged, her voice filled with despair. "I didn't die. She took you from me. I've waited so long to find you." Logan shook his head again, his expression hardening. He looked at the security guard. "Get that woman out of here. I don't know what she wants, but I don't have time for this." Before the security guard could move, Evelyn stepped forward, taking something else out of her bag, a second photo. It was identical to the one in the reliquary, but larger and clearly showed everyone's faces. "Look at that!" she exclaimed, almost shouting. "You're the baby in this picture. I'm your mother. I never gave up on you." Logan froze. For a brief moment, something in his expression changed, but he soon regained his composure. That's strange, but it doesn't prove anything," he said coldly. "I'm going to give you some financial help. Are you hungry? You can eat to your heart's content at the hotel buffet, but please don't bother me with this story anymore. I can't take any more disappointments." The lobby fell silent. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Evelyn felt her body tremble, but she gathered all the strength she had left. "Just listen to me. 5 minutes. That's all I ask." Logan looked at her for a long moment, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and doubt. Finally, he sighed and gestured for her to follow him. 5 minutes. More than that, and I'll call the police myself." Evelyn nodded, clutching the reliquary to her chest. That was all she needed, one chance. Logan Stewart's office was a reflection of his personality, modern, impeccable, and imposing. The dark wood floor gleamed under the soft light of the lamps, while a huge glass window offered a breathtaking view of the Blue Ridge Mountains in the distance. Perfectly aligned books decorated the mahogany shelves, and a large glass table occupied the center of the space, with minimalist but luxurious details. Evelyn entered hesitantly, carrying the invisible baggage of decades of suffering. Her worn-out coat looked out of place in the opulent surroundings, and her trembling hands clutched her handbag as if she feared someone would snatch it from her. Logan, on the other hand, seemed the embodiment of control. He stopped beside her desk, still holding the reliquary in his hand, his eyes fixed on her as if trying to dismantle the puzzle she represented. "All right, you've got 5 minutes," he said coldly, "and make it count, because frankly, none of this is making any sense." Evelyn took a deep breath, gathering the strength to speak. The silence in the room was so heavy that she could hear her own heart beating. "Well, you don't know who I am because something terrible happened when you were just a baby," she began, her voice breaking. "I'm your mother. Your real name is Logan Craig. You're my son, and I've spent the last 40 years trying to find you." He crossed his arms, leaning slightly against the table. "My mother died when I was little." "That's what I've always known. What you're saying is absurd." Evelyn opened the reliquary again, showing the photo once more. "You were only 2 years old when we were separated. I was married to your father, Henry Craig. We lived in a small house on Avery Creek, far from the luxury you have now. But we were happy." She stopped, trying to control her tears. "Until he died in an accident. A car hit him on his way home from work, and he didn't survive." Logan looked away for a moment, but then back at her, his eyes hard. "And that explains what? Why I have no memory of it? How did I end up with another family?" Evelyn clenched her hands, feeling the pressure of guilt and sadness built up over the years. "I was alone, Logan. No money, no family, no one to support me. I had to make a desperate decision. I left you with a neighbor for a few days while I tried to find a job here in Asheville to support us. She seemed trustworthy. But when I came back for you, she was gone, taken you away." Logan blinked, confused. It was clear that the story was beginning to move him, but his expression remained rigid. "Did you call the police? Did you look for me?" he asked, his voice rising in pitch. "Of course I did," exclaimed Evelyn, tears now flowing freely. "I did everything I could. But back then, me, a poor woman, alone, nobody cared. They said I must have been confused, that perhaps you had been taken for your own safety. I spent years looking for you, but I never found you, until now. Yesterday I saw your picture in a newspaper article about some opening of your hotel I don't know very well. But when I saw your picture, I knew for sure that you were my son. The same certainty I have now, looking at you. You have your father's eyes. I would never confuse them." Logan took a step back, as if he needed to create physical distance to deal with the emotional impact of the story. He began to pace back and forth, his face a mixture of disbelief and something more difficult to identify. "And how do you expect me to believe all this?" he asked, stopping abruptly and pointing at her. Evelyn swallowed. "The reliquary. You have another one, don't you?" "An identical one. When you were a baby, I made 2. One stayed with me, and the other I put around your neck. It was the only thing I could give you, and I didn't know it at the time. But today I know it was the only way to make sure you knew one day who you were." Logan remained motionless. The silence was so deep that Evelyn could hear the sound of the clock on the wall. He slowly reached into the inside pocket of his suit and pulled out a small reliquary, identical to the one she was holding. He opened it, revealing the same picture: a man, a woman, and a smiling baby. For a moment, Logan seemed disconnected from reality. He looked at the 2 reliquaries side by side, then at Evelyn. His expression hardened again, but this time there was something different in his eyes, a crack in his armor. "That still doesn't explain why no one told me about it before." His voice was a little lower now, but it still carried skepticism. "How did I end up with another family? Who brought me up?" Evelyn shook her head, frustrated with herself for not having all the answers. "I don't know, Logan. After the neighbor disappeared, you just disappeared. I don't know how you ended up with another family, but I can assure you that I never wanted to abandon you. Never." Logan rubbed his face with his hands, clearly overwhelmed. "Do you have any idea what you're asking of me? You show up here after decades and expect me to believe all this without question?" Evelyn stepped forward, ignoring the invisible barrier he seemed to be trying to maintain. "I don't expect you to accept me straight away. I just want you to know the truth. All I've done since the day you disappeared is try to find you. Please, Logan, give me the chance to prove that I'm telling the truth. If you want to do a test, we can do it. I'm willing." Logan was silent for a long time, his eyes locked on the reliquary. Finally, he sighed and closed both objects, putting his back in his pocket. "I don't know what to think about all this," But if it's true, then there's more I need to find out, and if it's not—" He let the sentence hang in the air, his expression somber. Evelyn nodded, understanding the weight of doubt he carried. "Do whatever you need to, Logan. I just want you to know that I've never given up on you. Never." He didn't reply immediately. After a few moments, he headed for the door. "I'll look into it. Until then, you can stay here in the hotel. I'll arrange a room for you. But don't get your hopes up." Evelyn felt the weight of his words, but decided to cling to the small hope he offered her. "Thank you, Logan. That's all I ask." He left without looking back, leaving Evelyn alone in the office. She slowly sat down in one of the chairs, feeling exhausted, but also relieved. As small a step as it was the start of something she had been waiting for almost all her life. The room Logan had provided for Evelyn was small, but extremely comfortable. The walls were neutral in tone, decorated with abstract paintings, and the bed was as soft as a hug. For Evelyn, who had spent the last few years sleeping in precarious conditions, from park benches to makeshift rooms in temporary shelters, the space felt like a piece of paradise, but the physical comfort wasn't enough to calm her restless mind. She sat on the edge of the bed, holding the reliquary in her wrinkled hands, her fingers running repeatedly over the worn surface. The feel of cold metal brought back vivid memories, like a movie she had watched so many times that she knew every scene by heart. She had seen Henry smile, heard Logan's laughter as a baby, felt the warmth of a life that had been snatched away from her in the blink of an eye. Evelyn knew that Logan was suspicious, and rightly so. It wasn't easy to accept that his whole story could be a lie. But she also knew that the truth was on her side, and it was only a matter of time before he realized it. Upstairs, Logan was in his luxurious apartment, surrounded by the heavy silence that filled the space when his family wasn't there. Addison, his wife, and their 2 children were away, and he found himself alone with his thoughts. Sitting in a leather armchair next to the panoramic window, he held his own reliquary, now open in his hand. He had always wondered about that object. Seemingly simple, but with a meaning he never fully understood. Whenever he asked the family who had brought him up, they either deflected the subject or gave vague answers, saying that it was something he already had when he was adopted. He never insisted. Perhaps part of him didn't want to know, but now, with Evelyn's arrival, it all seemed to come out at once. Logan picked up the phone and made a call to his personal assistant. "I want you to hire a private investigator," he said directly. "I need answers about my childhood. Find out everything you can about my adoption, documents, people, anything, and do it fast." After hanging up, Logan ran his hand over his face, feeling the weight of an anxiety he hadn't experienced for a long time. Evelyn Craig, his supposed mother. Her story seemed incredibly tragic, but also too absurd to be true. And yet, the reliquary in her hand seemed like an unbreakable link. The following days were filled with tension. Evelyn tried to keep a low profile in the hotel, but it wasn't easy to ignore the curious and, in some cases, hostile looks from the staff and guests. Some treated her with forced politeness, while others ignored her completely, as if she were invisible. One afternoon, while Evelyn was waiting in the hotel cafe area, 2 members of staff were whispering a few meters away. They weren't being subtle. "Is she still here?" said one of them, a young man in impeccable uniform. "I can't believe Mr. Stewart is putting up with this. It must be some kind of blackmail." "Of course it is," replied the other, an older woman. "A woman like that, looking like that? Clearly she's making up stories. I bet she wants money." Evelyn heard everything, but pretended not to. Her eyes remained fixed on the cup of tea she was holding, even though her hands were shaking slightly. She knew that people were talking about her, doubting her. It had always been like that. But that didn't make the words any less painful. However, there was something she didn't know. Logan was also struggling with his own internal conflicts. That evening, he received a preliminary report from the private investigator. The documents confirmed part of what Evelyn had said. He was, indeed, Logan Craig. The birth certificate matched the information she had provided, and there were clear indications that he had been adopted under unclear circumstances. But there was something else. A name, Mrs. Jacobs, the neighbor Evelyn had mentioned. According to records, she had died more than 20 years ago. Among her belongings was a letter that had never been sent. The investigator had obtained a copy of the letter, and Logan read it with growing discomfort. "Dear Evelyn, I feel I need to write this, even though I know I'll never have the courage to send it. When I took Logan with me, I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought he would have a better life, away from pain and poverty, but I never imagined how much it would hurt you, or the weight you would carry for doing it. You didn't deserve it, neither did he. I hope that somehow you can forgive me." Logan finished reading the letter and felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. He didn't know what to feel. Anger? Guilt? Confusion? He held the reliquary in his hand, squeezing it until his fingers ached. The letter not only confirmed Evelyn's story, but also revealed a side he had never imagined. The next day, Logan asked to meet Evelyn at the hotel restaurant. She arrived on time, but she was nervous. She felt that something had changed. He seemed less distant, although he still had the same serious expression. Logan placed the letter on the table between them. "Do you recognize this?" he asked, watching her intently. Evelyn picked it up with trembling hands. As she began to read, tears filled her eyes. "It's from her," she said, her voice breaking. "It's from Mrs. Jacobs." Logan nodded, crossing his arms. "It seems you were telling the truth all along." Evelyn looked at him, surprised and moved. But Logan held up a hand before she could say anything. "That doesn't mean everything's settled. I still have a lot of questions, lots of things to process, but—" He paused, sighing. "Maybe I should give you a chance to explain more. Maybe I should listen to everything." Evelyn nodded, feeling a small sense of relief. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The restaurant at the Grandview Hotel was spacious and sophisticated, with large windows offering a breathtaking view of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The white marble tables, decorated with carefully selected flower arrangements, were occupied by guests, chatting in low tones, immersed in an atmosphere of almost unreal luxury. Evelyn felt completely out of place as she waited for Logan. She held the reliquary in one hand, running her finger along the cold metal, seeking solace in the small object that symbolized her entire history. Logan arrived with his usual confident bearing, wearing a dark grey suit that seemed to scream success. He carried a leather briefcase in one hand and an intense gaze that seemed to run through her. Evelyn looked up, trying to decipher his expression, but he was an emotional wall. He sat down in front of her, placing the folder on the table and folding his hands. "I've received more information about my adoption," Logan began directly, "and it seems that everything you said is true." Evelyn felt her heart race. "So you believe me?" she asked, her voice heavy with emotion. Logan paused, leaning forward. "I believe the facts, Evelyn. The records prove that I am Logan Craig, your son. But that doesn't mean I understand or accept everything that happened." He paused, pointing to Jacob's letter, which was now in his possession. "This letter answers some questions, but leaves many others unanswered. Why did she do it? Why didn't you ever find me before?" Evelyn took a deep breath, feeling the weight of years of pain and regret pressing down on her. "I tried. I swear I tried, Logan. I spent years looking for you, going from town to town, following leads that led nowhere. There were no resources to help someone like me. I was a poor woman alone, facing a system that didn't care. Eventually, I lost everything, my home, my dignity, but I never gave up hope of finding you." Logan leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as he absorbed her words. There was something in her eyes, a mixture of anger and sadness that made it even harder to decipher. "And now you're here, after all these years," he said, with a humorless laugh. "Do you have any idea how hard it is for me to believe that? You appear out of nowhere, and I'm just supposed to accept that my whole life has been a lie." "I don't want to destroy your life, Logan," Evelyn replied firmly. "I just want to be a part of it, if only a little. I just want you to know the truth." Logan took the reliquary from his pocket and placed it on the table, next to Evelyn's. The two objects, identical, looked the same. The two objects, identical, seemed to carry decades of history in their small size. He looked at them both for a long moment before speaking again. "This reliquary has always been a mystery to me. I carried it when I was a child, even though I didn't know where it came from. I asked my adoptive parents several times, but never got clear answers. Now, here you are, telling me that it was the only bond you managed to leave with me before we were separated." Evelyn nodded, her eyes watering. I did it because I wanted you to have something to remember who you really were. I never imagined it would take so long for this to bring us together." Logan sighed deeply, rubbing his temples. "I don't know how to process all this. Part of me wants to believe you, but another part wonders if this isn't just a weight you're trying to put on me." "It's not a weight, Logan. It's the truth. You deserve to know who you are. You deserve to know that you were loved from the very first moment, even if life tore us apart." Logan was silent for a long moment, looking out of the window at the mountains in the distance. He was a man used to controlling all the variables around him, to making rational and calculated decisions. But nothing about this situation was rational. It was emotional, visceral, and he hated it. "I've lived my whole life thinking my mother was dead," he finally said. "I built an identity based on that, and now you come along and change everything. It's not easy for me, Evelyn." She nodded, understanding his pain and confusion. "I know it's not, and I don't expect it to be easy. I just hope you'll give me a chance to prove that I'm here for you, that I always have been. You don't have to accept everything at once, Logan. But let me try." Logan looked at her, and something in his expression softened, just a little. He picked up the two reliquaries and carefully put them back in his pocket. "I'll keep investigating. There are more things I need to understand before I make any decisions, but you can stay, at least for now." Evelyn felt a wave of relief and hope. It wasn't complete forgiveness, but it was a start. "Thank you, my son, that's all I need." "You can call me Logan, please," he corrected. Over the next few days, Logan alternated between doubts and small moments of curiosity about Evelyn. He began to ask more about Henry, his biological father, and what the first years of his life were like. Evelyn, for her part, shared her memories carefully, without wanting to push him too much. But not everything was peaceful. Logan faced resistance from his wife, Addison, who was skeptical about Evelyn's story. "Are you sure this isn't a scam?" Addison asked one evening while they were talking in the apartment. "People do terrible things for money, Logan." "I know that," he replied, frustrated, "but her story, the evidence, it all adds up. What if it's true? What if she really is my mother?" Addison sighed, crossing her arms. "And what are you going to do then? Make room for her in our lives as if nothing had happened? To be really sure, it's better to do a DNA test. That would settle it once and for all." "I don't know yet. It's not just about DNA. She could really be my biological mother and have abandoned me, and these stories could all be a big lie," Logan admitted. "But I feel like I can't just ignore it." A week later, the investigator returned the report and all the evidence he could gather. There was Henry's death certificate, Logan Craig's birth certificate as Henry and Evelyn's son, old newspaper pages showing the news of Logan's disappearance and Evelyn's desperation to find her son, the adoption record, which confirmed that Logan had been taken in by another family shortly after Henry's death, and even statements from former neighbors who had followed the story at the time. This report, combined with Jacob's letter, confirmed Evelyn's entire story. Logan read the report in silence, sitting in his office. Each word seemed to carry the weight of a truth that he could no longer ignore. For the first time, he felt a real connection with Evelyn, a mother he had never met, but who had clearly never given up on him. Logan sat in his office, holding the report that confirmed Evelyn's story. Every word on the paper seemed to pulse, bringing up a flood of emotions he couldn't name: anger, guilt, confusion, and, deep down, a twinge of sadness. He stood up, running a hand through his hair as he looked out of the window. The Blue Ridge Mountains were shrouded in a soft mist, as if nature shared his inner turmoil. "So it's true," he muttered to himself. He picked up the reliquary again, that small, insignificant object that now seemed to carry the weight of his entire identity. His mind went back to the fragments of childhood he remembered, flashes of love, of comfort, which seemed disconnected from the life he had with his adoptive parents. The vision of Evelyn holding the identical reliquary reappeared in his mind insistently. He knew what he had to do. Evelyn was sitting in the bedroom, looking out of the small window. Even with the comfort Logan had provided, she felt an overwhelming loneliness. Every minute that passed was a mixture of hope and despair. Would he believe her completely? Would he accept her? A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. She stood up quickly, straightening her coat as if this would somehow improve her appearance. When she opened the door, she found Logan standing there, holding the report in one hand. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice softer than she had ever heard it before. Evelyn nodded, stepping back to let him pass. He entered, glancing around the simple room before turning to her. His eyes met hers, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Finally, Logan broke the silence. "I've read the report," he began, holding up the paper as if it were evidence in a trial. "Everything matches. The reliquary, the letter, the adoption records. There's no doubt that you're telling the truth." Evelyn felt her legs shaking and had to sit on the edge of the bed. Tears began to form in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "Thank you for believing in me," she said, her voice shaking. Logan shook his head. "I should be the only one thanking you. You've been through so much, and you're still here trying to make amends. I was cruel to you at first, and I'm sorry for that." Those words opened a floodgate of emotions in Evelyn. She put her hand to her chest, trying to control her tears. "You had every right to doubt, Logan. I didn't expect it to be easy. I just wanted a chance to explain and get closer to you. For all this lost time." He nodded, coming over and sitting down in the armchair opposite the bed. For the first time, he seemed more human, more vulnerable. "It's still hard for me to process all this. I've spent my whole life believing that my mother was dead, that I was someone else. And now you're here, proving me wrong. It's not easy to change my whole perception of myself." Evelyn smiled sadly. "I don't want to change who you are. I just want you to know where you came from. That you understand that you've always been loved, even if life has torn us apart. I never gave up hope of finding you." After days of reflection and investigation, Logan decided to face the truth about how his childhood had been torn away from Evelyn. He and Evelyn agreed that they needed to fully understand Jacob's role in the story, so Logan asked the private investigator to review the available records, focusing on the neighbor who had taken the baby. The investigator brought back new information a few days later. He found a person who had indirect connections to Mrs. Jacobs, a distant cousin named Martha, who now lived in a nursing home. Logan and Evelyn visited Martha, eager to hear her version of events. The nursing home was only a few kilometers from Asheville. It was a simple but clean place, with bright corridors and patients in wheelchairs. When Logan and Evelyn entered the common room, a nurse led them to Martha. The woman, in her 90s, had the distant look of someone used to solitude, but her eyes lit up when she knew why they were there. "Mrs. Jacobs," Martha repeated with a bitter smile. "Oh yes, I remember well. Matilda, my cousin. She was a complicated case, very religious, very strict. She always thought she knew what was best for everyone." Evelyn leaned forward, her heart racing. "Why did she take my son? I trusted her," Martha sighed, her skinny fingers smoothing the fabric of the blanket covering her legs. "Matilda believed she was saving the boy. She said you were young, poor, and incapable of raising a child. She thought he needed a better life, so she did something terrible. She took the boy away without his permission." Evelyn put her hand to her chest, trying to control her emotions. But what did she do with him? Where did she take him? Matilda knew she wouldn't be able to raise the child. She was already old at the time. So she gave the baby to a family in Charlotte, one she knew from church. They couldn't have children and were desperate to adopt. She thought she was doing what God wanted, giving the boy a life with resources and stability. Logan stood motionless, his fists clenched. And no one questioned that. They accepted a baby with no legal record. Martha shrugged, a sad look in her eyes. Things were different back then. There wasn't the same kind of supervision that there is today. And Jacobs was persuasive. She convinced the family that the birth mother no longer wanted the boy. They believed her. Evelyn couldn't hold back the tears. The idea that Jacobs had judged her ability to be a mother, that she had considered her inadequate without even trying to help her, was devastating. "Who was this family?" Logan asked, his tone firm. "I need to know more." Martha hesitated, but eventually gave a name: the Stewarts, an upper-middle-class family who lived in a quiet neighborhood in Charlotte. Logan recognized the surname immediately. "They're my adoptive parents," he said, with an incredulous expression. Evelyn put a hand to her mouth in shock. She looked at Logan, reality settling in. "They raised you, thinking they were doing the right thing." Logan decided to confront his adoptive parents about what he had discovered. He visited them at their home in Charlotte, taking Evelyn along, although she was reluctant. When he arrived, he was greeted by his adoptive mother, Margaret, an elegant-looking woman who seemed uncomfortable with the unexpected visit. After a few minutes of casual conversation, Logan could no longer hold back. "I found out something about my adoption," he said, his voice firm, "and I want to know the truth. Did you know that I was taken from my birth mother against her will?" Margaret turned pale, and her husband Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Logan, why are you bringing this up now?" Margaret asked, trying to look calm. "That was so long ago." "Because the woman you took me from is here," he replied, pointing to Evelyn, who was sitting quietly, her hands trembling in her lap. "This is Evelyn Craig, my biological mother." The shock on Margaret's face was undeniable. She looked at Evelyn, then at Logan before looking away. We didn't know that," said Margaret, her voice wavering. "Mrs. Jacobs told us that the birth mother didn't want the baby. She said she was abandoning the child. We thought we were doing good, Logan. We thought we were giving you a better life." Evelyn finally spoke, her voice shaky but charged with emotion. "I never wanted to abandon my son. I loved Logan more than anything. Mrs. Jacobs lied to you, but she destroyed my life in the process." Margaret began to cry, covering her face with her hands. I'm so sorry. We never knew. If we had known." She looked at Logan, begging for understanding. "We loved you like our own son. We did the best we could for you." Logan sighed, running a hand through his hair. It was a lot to process. He knew that his adoptive parents had been deceived, but that didn't lessen the pain of the truth. "I know you did the best you could," he said at last. "But now I know who I am, and I know where I came from." Evelyn, although devastated by the revelation, felt a small spark of relief. At last, the pieces had fallen into place. Mrs. Jacobs, with her twisted good intentions, had destroyed lives. But in the end, the truth emerged. Logan was able to see that his adoptive parents had no ill intentions, but the hurt of being separated from Evelyn still ran deep. The realization that Evelyn had never given up on him was what finally brought him closer to her. Logan wanted to rebuild a relationship with Evelyn without discarding the love he had for his adoptive parents. He understood that his story was complicated, but that didn't mean he couldn't find peace. Evelyn, for her part, felt that despite everything she had lost, she had finally regained something precious: her son. Over the next few days, Logan began to spend more time with Evelyn. He bought her new clothes, new shoes. He took her to places she had never had the chance to visit, including the mountainous areas around Asheville, where he liked to walk to clear his mind. During one of these walks, Evelyn told more stories about Henry and Logan's early years. "Your father was a good man, Logan," she said, stopping to catch her breath as they walked up a small trail. "He did everything for us. When you were born, he said you were the most precious thing that had ever happened." She looked at her son, smiling. "You have his eyes." Logan stopped, looking at her with an expression that was hard to decipher. Finally, he smiled slightly. "I want to know everything about him." "It's good to hear things like that." Evelyn nodded, feeling that for the first time she was really getting to know her son. Every moment they spent together seemed to erase some of the pain of the lost years. Logan and Evelyn were sitting in the small garden next to the Grandview Hotel. It was a clear afternoon, with the sound of leaves swaying gently in the wind, but the atmosphere between them was heavy. Logan had started asking questions about Evelyn's past. Now that he knew she was his biological mother, he wanted to better understand how she had lived all those years they had been apart. Logan propped his elbows on his knees and looked at Evelyn with a serious expression, but not as cold as before. He wanted answers, but part of him was afraid to hear what she had to say. "You mentioned that you lost everything after I disappeared," he began, choosing his words carefully. "What exactly happened? How did you come to living on the streets?" Evelyn, who held the reliquary in her hands, looked at him with tired but determined eyes. She knew this moment would come. She took a deep breath, trying to organize the memories that still hurt like open wounds. "It all started after you were taken by Mrs. Jacobs," she began, her voice shaking. "I was desperate, Logan. I had no idea where you were or how to find you. I spent weeks trying to track down Mrs. Jacobs, but it was as if she had disappeared from the face of the earth." She paused, looking up at the sky for a moment before continuing. "I scraped together some savings, small, but it was all I had. I used it to pay for newspaper ads, hire detectives, anything that might give me a clue as to where you were. But nothing worked. Everything was a dead end." Logan leaned forward, his eyes fixed on her. It was the first time he'd heard about her efforts, and something inside him began to crack. "What about the house?" he asked, his voice softer. "What happened to your house?" Evelyn clutched the reliquary tighter as if she needed it to continue. "After a year of no answers, I realized that the money had run out. I couldn't go on. So I did something I thought was my only option. I mortgaged the house." Logan blinked, surprised. He hadn't expected that answer. "You mortgaged the house to keep looking for me?" Evelyn nodded with a sad smile. "It was the only thing of value I had. I used the money to finance more searches, to keep paying the detectives, to make more announcements, to travel after the clues. I found a lot of clues. For a while, this gave me hope, because I felt I was making progress, however small. But months passed, and I couldn't find you. All the clues were false. She lowered her eyes, shame and sadness weighing her down. Then came the notice from the bank. I was so consumed by the search that I couldn't hold down a steady job. Before I knew it, I was months behind on my payments. They took the house. Logan closed his eyes and ran his hands over his face. He knew that his biological mother had suffered, but he never imagined that she had sacrificed so much. "And after that?" he asked, his voice heavy with emotion. "Where did you go?" Evelyn shrugged, a small gesture that hid a mountain of pain. "I tried to find shelter with friends and acquaintances, but it wasn't easy. People get tired of helping when you have nothing to offer in return. Eventually, I ended up in homeless shelters. Those were the worst years of my life, Logan. Not just because of the lack of comfort, but because I felt like a ghost, invisible to everyone." Logan was silent for a moment. He had never known struggle like that. Never known what it was like to lose everything. The thought of his mother wandering the streets, invisible to the world, was almost unbearable. "And yet, you kept looking for me?" he asked, almost in a whisper. Evelyn looked up at him, her eyes full of tears, but also of unshakable strength. "I never stopped, Logan. Even when I had nowhere to sleep or anything to eat, you were all I could think about. I walked the streets with your reliquary around my neck, telling myself that if I still had that, I still had hope." She took a deep breath, trying to control her emotions. "Life was hard, but I never gave up. And then, I saw your picture in the newspaper. It was as if God had finally shown me that it hadn't all been in vain." Logan looked away, unable to face the weight of guilt that was beginning to grow inside him. He knew he wasn't to blame for what had happened, but he couldn't help feeling that he should have known somehow. I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I had no idea you'd been through all this." Evelyn reached out and touched his hand, a shy gesture but full of love. "You had no way of knowing, son, and I'm not here to blame you. I'm here because after everything, I still believe we can make up for lost time." Logan looked at her, and for the first time, he saw not just the woman who had entered his hotel that day, but a mother who had sacrificed everything for him. His expression softened, and he held her hand in response. "You don't deserve any more pain, Evelyn," he said, his voice firm now. "I can't change what happened in the past, but I can guarantee that you'll never go through anything like this again. I promise." Evelyn smiled, the tears rolling freely now. For the first time in decades, she felt the weight on her shoulders begin to ease. Logan, her son, was finally beginning to see her for what she really was, a mother who never gave up. Logan then decided to introduce Evelyn to his wife, Addison, and their children, Max and Dallas. Addison was still skeptical, but Logan convinced her that it was important. The first interaction was tense. Addison remained reserved, but Max and Dallas, curious, approached their grandmother with the innocence typical of children. "Are you really our grandmother?" asked 8-year-old Dallas, her eyes wide. Evelyn smiled, thrilled. "Yes, darling, I am your grandmother. And I'm very happy to meet you." 10-year-old Max held something out to Evelyn, a drawing he had made of a family. "I made this for you," he said shyly. Evelyn held the drawing as if it were the greatest treasure she had ever received. "It's beautiful, Max. I'll treasure it forever." Addison watched from a distance, but her expression began to soften as she saw the interaction between Evelyn and the children. When Logan approached, she whispered, "Maybe she really is who you say she is." "Maybe I judged too soon." Logan just nodded, relieved. Despite the reconnection, Evelyn began to feel the effects of her deteriorating health. During a doctor's appointment that Logan insisted she attend, they discovered that she needed urgent heart surgery. Evelyn tried to downplay the seriousness of the situation. "I've lived long enough, Logan. I don't want to be a burden to you," she said, as they sat in the doctor's office. Logan held her hand tightly, his eyes fixed on hers. "You're not a burden. You never were. And I'm not going to lose you again, Mom. Not now." Evelyn couldn't hold back the tears. For the first time, he had called her Mom. Logan provided the best medical team and was by her side throughout the process. In the days before the surgery, he visited her every day, bringing the children to cheer her up and sharing memories they were creating together. The surgery was a success, but the most emotional moment happened during recovery. Logan entered the hospital room, holding a bouquet of flowers. He sat beside Evelyn's bed, holding her hand. "We're here, Mom," he said, looking at her with a warm smile. "All of us, and we'll never be apart again." Evelyn smiled, feeling a peace she hadn't felt for decades. She finally had her family back. Months later, Evelyn was fully recovered and living in a small house in Asheville, close to Logan and his family. At a family dinner, Logan made a toast. To family," he said, raising his glass. "To strength, perseverance, and never giving up on each other." Evelyn looked around the table, seeing her grandchildren, Addison and Logan. Tears of joy streamed down her face. After years of suffering, she had finally found what she had been looking for: a home,